I think now that means that we are live and people should be able to see us. If people could see us beforehand, that's me typing in the description of what we're doing. And as the people join us, you will know that we do these on a weekly basis now. And today we are talking benefits. We have got Kate Green, who is the Shadow Benefits Minister in our newly formed Shadow Front Bench. And will talk to us about some of the key issues that we've been raising with government during this crisis, about how they've been adapting and some of the failures, I guess, to make the changes that need to happen. We've got Emma and Patti from the Brighton and Hove Citizens Advice Bureau. Patti is an advisor and Emma Daniels works on stakeholder engagement and some of the communications issues, and they'll be talking about locally what we are seeing in our city, which of course covers the majority of the constituency. For those of you in the Lewis district, there is a different Citizens Advice Bureau in the Lewis district, but there is always communication between them and us and the Brighton and Hove Citizens Advice Bureaus. So if you're unsure, get in contact, and then we usually try and find you to the right place. The rule of thumb is if you live in Peacehaven, Telscombe and Saltdean, you're probably in the Lewis district, and if you live elsewhere in the constituency, you're probably in the Brighton district. But it gets a bit funny around Saltdean, so don't worry about it if you don't quite know, and get in contact. That's the main thing. So why have we done a session this time on benefits? Well, lots of people we know are currently on sick. They are currently have been dismissed from their jobs. Many people who may never have experienced being on the benefit system might now be having to look to come and access benefits. And some of us will have known some of these issues for a very long time, but a long wait, 5 week at least wait, the difficulty of drawing down money early that doesn't burden you in debt is a big problem. And whilst the people at the Job Centre Plus here in Brighton are very nice, lovely people, we've got good relationships with them, and I'm sure that Emma and Patti will talk about that as well. They are having to operate a system that is not designed always to be the nicest for when you are struggling and finding it difficult. So we wanted to run this to talk about the two ends of it. One is the policy end. Yes, some of the benefit amounts have been increased, but actually what are the big flaws in some of the policy issues and what are we trying to fix? And then secondly, talk about some of the examples here. So the first person I want to bring in is Kate Green. Kate is our Shadow Minister, and I know that we've been working with Kate, haven't we, as a whole Labour Party to try and push the government, not in an aggressive way, but in a positive way, so they get some of these things right during this crisis, because there are some things that are just not fit for purpose. And universal credit, we always said wasn't fit for purpose, but some of that's been highlighted even more now. I don't know, Kate, if you want to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, thank you, Lloyd, and thank you for inviting me to join you this afternoon. It's absolutely right that many, many more people will be having experience of the social security system who perhaps have not needed to before. And we've seen an enormous surge in the number of people applying for universal credit since the beginning of the crisis. If you compare the figures in March compared with March last year, you would see an enormous surge, or even compared with the month before, an enormous surge. I think now well over 1.5 million new applications that DWP are processing. And I think it's greatly to the credit of the department that they are managing to deal with that volume of applications. Great credit to the staff who are doing that work. And I have to say, I've also been pleasantly surprised that so far the system hasn't fallen over. I did have a lot of concerns about universal credit and whether it would be able to cope with such a large volume of applications. And so far, people report that their applications are being processed. And that's in part because, of course, some of the normal processes have been relaxed, so that, for example, you don't need to present certain information now to make a claim for the benefit. But what people will be realizing is that you don't get very much money. And in particular, if you've got, as you will have in the Brighton area, where housing costs are high rent to pay, or if you've got a family to support, you will be struggling to make ends meet. And that's why, while we welcome some of the announcements that the government's made so far to improve the level of benefits, we think there's more to be done. So it's good that the government has raised the standard rate in universal credit by £1,000 a year. It's good that they've raised the local housing allowance, the level at which UC can support your rent, to 30% of the local market. But that still leaves people with a number of real problems. And Lloyd, you mentioned the first and perhaps one of the easiest to understand. Why do people have to wait 5 weeks until they receive their first universal credit payment? It's possible to ask for that payment to be advanced to you early, but then that's treated as a loan that you have to pay back. Labour is saying that payment should just be made up front at the start of the payment of your claim. And while the government say that there are difficulties with the technology, we believe that it should be possible to make cash payments up front, and there's no need, even if it's done in the form of an advance, to recover that payment afterwards. It's also interesting that although the increase has been made to the standard rate in UC, and in tax credits, we haven't seen a similar improvement for job seekers allowance and employment support allowance and legacy benefits. We think that there should be a similar uplift for people on those benefits too. And for my portfolio, which is focused on our development of a child poverty strategy, these measures are not doing enough to help families with the cost of raising children. And we know that families are struggling to provide for their children. We know too that the government school food voucher scheme has been a bit of a debacle in its early days. And so the third thing that we would like to see is the 2-child limit in universal credit and tax credits removed. I've always thought it was an invidious policy, and it's particularly causing acute difficulty for families now in meeting the costs of looking after their children. 2 other things we'd like to see done now to improve universal credit. We'd like the savings limit, the savings threshold to be removed so that your savings wouldn't be taken into account. This emergency has hit everybody completely out of the blue. It's not good that people should be penalised for having set money aside when this is on a scale that none of us could ever have imagined. And the final thing is that the benefit cap, another long-standing invidious policy from the previous Conservative governments, which means that even if the government is helpfully raising the local housing allowance and the standard rate and making other payments to families, that's a complete nonsense if it means that you're then going to go over the benefit cap and start seeing your benefit clawed back again. And so we think the cap should be scrapped for the duration of this crisis too. So that's some of the things we're calling for early on. There's much more that I think we want to consider. And of course, quite a lot depends on how long the crisis goes on, because clearly the impact on family and child poverty is going to be greater if this is a prolonged crisis and people can't get back to work. And we'd be very, very concerned about the impact on child poverty rates, and particularly on persistent poverty, if this crisis becomes very, very prolonged. So I hope that gives you a sort of initial feel for what the Shadow Work and Pensions team has been calling for.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much, Kate. And I know it's particularly child poverty, where children are now not in schools, where there was an element of basic food provided for many children, has been an issue that has been raised particularly locally. Around trying to make sure that we get the food partnership works to get the food to people. And we discussed that in a previous Zoom call, but general issues around child poverty are really concerning. They, of course, have increased in the last 10 years, not decreased. And that's why we need to look not just in the immediate part of this crisis, but longer term, coming out of this crisis, what we're doing to tackle some of these things. And in Brighton, in the previous administration, there was, of course, a really important piece of work around school uniforms and around the cost of trying to bring those things down. Now, look, Emma, the work and Patti, the work that you both do in the Citizens Advice Bureau is often the front line of this. Are there particular trends that you're seeing at the moment, Emma, in the Citizens Advice Bureau that you're particularly worried about, or that you think that needs flagging up?
Thanks, and thanks so much for inviting us on. We obviously are non-party political, so we would support any party in this kind of discussion, just to make that clear up front. So a lot of people don't realise about the CAB that we are 80 years old, and that we were set up as part of the Second World War kind of welfare settlement. So in 1939, as things like ration books and an emergency issues were dealt with by the government, one of the things they felt people needed was also proper advice about those type of issues. And so I feel like, you know, we have a history and we were born out of exactly these type of national emergencies where everybody needs to have the opportunity to have fair access to services and have be looked after. So I'd echo, and indeed National Citizens Advice would echo some of the calls to action that Kate Green made. We would particularly, urge the government to consider removing any kind of savings limit on applying for the EC. It's a national emergency, and in such a crisis, you know, that should be waived. And we would also seriously urge the government and obviously the opposition to press for removing the 5-week wait. Now that at the moment, as you apply for universal credit, you can ask for an advance, which is a loan, as we've mentioned, something that my colleague Patti has a lot more technical knowledge on than me. But what I do know that these loans cause in terms of the long-term impact is that then as they're taken off the benefits, they're causing debt issues. Now, obviously, there's family issues, welfare issues around not having enough money as a result of having your benefits top sliced to pay that advance back that arise. What I think, and because we're part of a sort of ecosystem of welfare in the city, and we work with a few banks, we work with the council, and we work with many organisations, so we kind of look at things strategically. And I think one of the things that people don't realise is around that 5-week advance is that then causes issues of income for the local authority, because they're then in the position where someone might be missing rent payments, might be missing council tax payments, causing them to have a knock-on impact on what they're able to provide, because clearly they're generally incredibly good about putting in some kind of support where they can, but that they don't have the amount of money in the council to put back all of the money that's missing. So they have to kind of pick and choose cases based on hardship to fund. So I think that one of the knock-on effects of the 5-week wait is not just on that household, but also on the ability of the local authority to be able to function, particularly as so many more people have come up onto universal credit in the past few months. And in terms of numbers, nationally in the first week of the crisis and as we began lockdown, the National Citizens Advice website had a 13,000% increase in views. So it is a fantastic website. So a lot of info on there is helps you help yourself. So they had 2.2 million views, and a lot of the queries were about, and the top one was, you need help because you can't pay your bills because of coronavirus. The other startling, I think, issue for government is how many people are coming through for help with prepayment meters, and the impact on people being able to pay for electricity and gas. So I would urge people to if that is their case, to get in touch with CAB, because locally we have a scheme where we can give you grants for prepayment meter arrears. So please let us use them and help you. But in the long term, I'm not quite, I think there's a query around how sustainable that is, and that charity grants can't be a long-term solution.
Fantastic, thank you, Emma. Patti, have you found that people coming in have struggled? I mean, I suspect they struggle often trying to navigate the system, but have you found that you've had to advise people how to get around the system more at the moment?
I guess part of what's interesting at the moment is that we're seeing a lot of people who haven't come in contact with the benefit system before, and it's not necessarily clear. There's a lot of questions on the universal credit application which aren't necessarily aren't as clear as they could be, and as an advisor you can know when you can be vague and when you need to be specific, and members of the public don't have that. So we're getting a lot of people who are just very anxious and really worried about getting it wrong, and that's delaying claims. And one of the issues with universal credit and the 5-week wait is that you can't really backdate universal credit claims, only in very exceptional circumstances. So we're also seeing people who maybe thought that they would find an alternative to claiming universal credit, and they're making a claim maybe a few weeks after they would have done otherwise. So actually they're going more like 2 months without any income at all, and that's another part of it. Also the presumption that everyone will have access to the internet is a particularly difficult issue at the moment, because with so many claims you can't get through on the phone. So people who are needing to make telephone claims, which does obviously happen because not everyone does have access to the internet, those people are really not able to submit their claims, and they're often the more vulnerable households as well. And we do have a service that helps with that, which is called Help to Claim. The details are on our website, but we're also still struggling to get through ourselves. So yeah, capacity is a real issue at the moment.
I should mention as well that people with disabilities claiming PIP, one of the things that other advice organisations as well as citizens advice in the city are trying to help people with those forms, and they're really difficult, and it's under the current circumstances in particular, because those forms have to be printed out and copied and then signed and returned. That's really slow process. So St Luke's Advice Service is working at the moment to be the partner within our partnership who are prepared to print off the forms, post them off, get them back, check them, post them back to the client before they get posted off again. But this is a really, really long process. As Patti says, some of these things are easier if you have the internet, and a lot of people are doing brilliant in terms of self-service, especially if they're already confident users of the internet for work, for example. But these, so it just to not to lose sight of the fact that people who may, completely unrelated to the COVID issue, need benefits because they have a disability or an illness, may be struggling to get that done, whilst there's basically no one offering face-to-face interviews at the moment. Every advice surgery is done virtually or by telephone. Just to say as well that after a massive spike in calls in the first few weeks, not enough people are phoning us, and we're worried about that, a bit like people going into the A&E services for health. We're incredibly worried that people aren't using us by telephone when we are available to help them. We're particularly quiet between 9 and 11 at the Citizens Advice Bureau in Brighton and Hove. So if you phone between them, you've got a great chance of getting through straight away. And we'd really urge you to, because we feel that you might have problems with issues that you're thinking, well, that's not super urgent, so I'll leave it for now. But we're expecting quite a lot of demand as restrictions lift and people's situation becomes a bit more permanent, whether that's employed or unemployed, or various other things. So we're expecting, and we also worry about quite a lot of debt issues, as people have maybe got into debt just to manage over this period, or have or haven't been chased so much by banks and stuff, because they are they are trying not to put any extra pressure on people, which is good. But we expect an increased demand. So if you do have an issue, please phone us.
Look, I think that's a big message that we always give out, I think, in these Zooms, is that if anyone has an issue, it's always better to get in contact. If you're struggling to pay your bills, if you're struggling to pay your rent, get in contact with the person that you're struggling to pay it with, your landlord or the electricity company or whoever, because they may have the ability to, they might not, but they may have the ability to give you waivers or allowances, etc. And also contact the advice centres, the support networks that are there, either my office, the Citizens Advice Bureau, Possibility People, St Luke's, the Brighton Unemployed Centre. I've probably missed out Money Works. I've probably missed out a local one or two there, but that's the majority that are in the Brighton end. And of course, we've got Citizens Advice and Brighton Housing Trust that work over both parts of the constituency, and they usually can be contacted as well. Look, we've got some questions coming in, so let's try and rattle through some of these. Different people will pick up them, I'm sure. There's one here, which I don't know if Kate or can answer. I don't quite know. The question is, are the changes to the housing allowance rates permanent? So for those of you who don't know, until 2010, it was 50% of all the cheapest housing in your area would be covered. The Conservatives then changed it to 30% of the lowest, and they also stopped it increasing by inflation. And so it stuck at the 2011 rate, I think it was, until this year, which meant it was much lower. It was something like the 10th cheapest housing in Brighton. Conservatives have now moved it back up to the 30th percentile in real terms. They haven't returned it back to the 50th percentile that we had in 2010. But is that return to the 30th percentile, is that going to be a permanent thing, or are we going to see it going back to what it was? Kate, do you know the answer to that, or?
I'm not sure I do know, but I rather suspect it's a temporary measure, as I suspect the other announcements that have been made will be too. And you're right, Lloyd, particularly in high cost areas like Brighton and Hove, you've got a real mismatch now between local rents and what the housing element actually covers in your benefit. And so it's good that we've got it pegged back to the actual level of rents, albeit, as you say, only at the 30th percentile. And I think there will be pressure for that to be increased further. People can't move at the moment. The government's argument was always that, well, if people are living in housing that they can't afford, they should downsize or move to cheaper accommodation or move out of the city centre or whatever it is. Even if that's a reasonable position to take, and you may have your own views on how reasonable it is, even in good times, it's absolutely impossible for people to move at the moment. There is no option to leave your home and find another place to live, and landlords and tenants are absolutely stuck. So I think there's a very, very strong case for looking at whether even the 30th percentile is adequate, given that people are absolutely trapped at the moment. And my own view is that, like you, Lloyd, I think detaching housing payments from what's actually going on in the local rental market is wrong in principle for the long term. So whatever the government's intentions, I think Labour should be continuing to push for that reconnection between the level of local housing allowance, whatever it is, and the market, not pegging it to some sort of figure that's got no relationship to what people actually have to pay out as rent.
Yes. Quite right. I mean, the Conservatives claimed in 2000, and Conservatives and Liberals, we should remember, the coalition claimed that they wanted to try and reduce rents, but they put the punishment on the renter rather than putting a series of controls on rent, which would have been far more reasonable, and which what other countries do. Now, there's an argument about how you do rent controls, but what they did is they punished people who were the poorest in society to try and squeeze rents down, which just didn't work. Look, we've got another question here.
Oh, sorry.
Emma, go on.
Just
jump in whenever you want to, please.
It just says on the government website that those have been set until next May, I think. So I think that's something that gets redecided in 12 months' time.
I mean, my suspicion is that we will remain at the 30th percentile. It won't go down in cash terms. The question is, will it then continue to inflate at normal speeds as the local housing market is? That's the question that we'll have to come back to in May time. I suspect those out there, you're not going to suddenly see it reducing back down again. And I think that would be very difficult politically for them to do. But Kate and I will have to put the pressure up, and the advice centres will have to keep that pressure up. I think we've got one here from Kate that we've kind of answered already, but I'll just make sure. It says, do people need to pay back the advances they receive for universal credit? And what if they get a job before they pay it back? Patti, they have to pay it back either way, don't they?
Yeah, so you pay it back over up to 12 months through your benefit. You can pay it back in a shorter period if you'd like. They will expect you to pay it back if you get a job. So you might get a letter saying, please pay this back. If you somehow manage to get away with not doing that, then it will creep back up on you if you make a claim in the future. And that would be a debt on top of another advance, I would anticipate.
So it's difficult. I mean, the line is it's difficult to get away from. That's why many of us have said that it should be a grant or rather than a loan. But
yeah, you can get a up to 3-month grace period, I believe, if it's really causing you hardship. But that doesn't really solve the issue, really. No, it doesn't. Look, we've got another one here from John. John says the government has been really slow with funding for freelancers. I guess you could say the self-employed generally, and unclear about the messaging of who is eligible. They're being told, or freelancers are being told, don't call us, we'll call you. Now, there's a myriad of different kind of things that freelancers and self-employed can get. There's the scheme for self-employed people, but if you don't fulfill that, you then have to go into the universal credit system. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right, Lloyd. I mean, as you say, the government has been slow to produce an income replacement scheme for the self-employed, similar to what it was able to offer for employees. It has now begun to put that in place, but obviously people have been without money for a number of weeks. And some, as you say, will continue to fall down the cracks, even with the new scheme that's now in place, and will be forced to make a claim for universal credit. And that can be particularly problematic, I think, for self-employed people. Accessing the government scheme is difficult for them if they can't evidence particular patterns of employment, if they've had a lot of contracts which suggest that maybe they're not exactly self-employed, but equally they're all short-term contracts. Accessing the universal credit scheme, they're going to struggle sometimes to produce income information. And of course, it's really not fair, I think, to expect them to go into that universal credit process when, to all intents and purposes, they've been working and should be getting the same protection as people with employment contracts. So there's a lot of concern and upset, I think, among contractors, freelancers. And again, I imagine it's quite a feature of your local employment market in Brighton. It certainly is where I'm an MP in Manchester, because we have Media City and we have a lot of tech, digital and also arts professionals who are in this situation. And it's not at all clear that the government's scheme for them is either comprehensive enough or has come in quickly enough.
No, we had some good news today a glimmer of good news that the government, if you're self-employed or were self-employed or freelancer and are having to claim benefits or having to claim other support, and you've put aside money to pay your tax bill, which you usually would pay at the end of the year, that will now be disregarded in any claim that you now need to make, which there was a bit of a worry that some people who might have been only self-employed for a bit have put a few £1,000s aside to pay their taxes, and then the government was going to say that that was part that you had to eat into that because you couldn't claim universal credit or other support because there's a threshold, and then at the end of the year they'd be left short because they wouldn't have enough money to pay their tax. That now has been resolved. But Emma, you mentioned, didn't you, that the difficulty of some people who have savings and then are not able to claim, and they may have made these savings for good, sensible plans. You know?
Yeah, I mean, the Citizens Advice nationally are urging the government to basically overlook savings right now and not consider them in terms of any of the benefits, because it's such an unusual kind of a situation that they don't believe it's fair. In terms of the self-employed income support scheme, Citizens Advice are saying that it needs to be extended to people who've been self-employed for less than a year. And they also want some assurances that people without recourse to public funds should be able to claim it. So that means basically people who are working here who aren't citizens here and aren't entitled to benefits ordinarily, because I guess ordinarily the argument would be that they could return home and claim benefits from somewhere else. That would be under maybe ordinary circumstances, depending on your perspective. Obviously, I'm not being judgmental on this. An option, but at the moment, clearly that option is not responsible and does not exist, and therefore, that should be considered. And I think probably, I know that women's organisations in the city are also concerned about women without recourse in terms of escaping domestic abuse. Right now, there is no option to return to another country, even if that was practical and safe for that particular household. Anyway, under ordinary circumstances, it certainly wouldn't be now. So it's that consideration to those workers. Finally, as far as I can see from what we're pushing for in terms of Citizens Advice, it's also a long-term furlough scheme for people who are at increased risk in the high-risk category until there is some sort of, I guess, vaccination or a level of normality returned to, that people who are working and whose job wouldn't normally be eligible for furloughing, or who are self-employed but and so are in a different category altogether, that they should be protected for coming months until there is safety for them.
Yes, I've got a question here. We link to that. It says, are people eligible for statutory sick pay if they have COVID? I'm right in thinking they are, but there's a slightly different way of certificating that.
Yeah, they are entitled, aren't they? But I think I'm not sure if the colleagues from Citizens Advice can say a bit more about the certification arrangements.
Patti. I'm just going to look that up.
So yeah, they can claim statutory sick pay, and they should be eligible from the first week. I believe the government has asked employers just to take that people and just trust them that's the case. But if they do need a fit note or a sick note, as most people know them, they can get that from calling 111 and explaining that they've got symptoms. So it's not as complicated as having to go to your GP and all of that like you'd usually have to do.
Good. I've got a very specific one here, Patti, from James. So he says, when he logs into his Universal Credit account, it tells me, for now, your work coach will not check if you are keeping these commitments, referring to job seeking. But it also warns me that I could be subject to sanctions if I do not keep up my job hunt. Sounds like a catch-22, doesn't it? It then also says, do not call Universal Credit about anything in your case file. I really don't understand what my current obligations are, and I don't know how to find out. I don't want to be caught out. You know, kind of, this is a big problem. It's unclarity. Do you have any clarity for that from what you've experienced?
So work commitments have all been paused for the moment. So you shouldn't be sanctioned for not meeting work search commitments. However, you may have a claimant commitment which says that you have to do other things in terms of preparing for work. And if you're still able to do those things, you should still do them. But if you want clarity, don't call them, they're right, because you won't be able to get through. But you can write a note on your journal, and your work coach will see it and they'll respond. So if you're feeling really anxious about it, that's the way to speak to someone. And because that's managed by work coaches rather than case managers, those are the people based in the job centre, and they should be quite quick at responding.
Good. That's a relief, hopefully, for people. A lot of this is that the communications, and of course it's natural, it's a crisis and everything's being rolled out very quickly, but the communications have made people very unsure about where they sit, and I think that is what causes a lot of the difficulties. I've got a question here from Carmel, which again is a very practical question, but something also I think for wider about some of the disability benefits particularly. She says, are you able to appeal a decision made on a benefit while this crisis is happening? And what rate of pay do you get whilst you appeal? Now, my understanding is you can try and lodge some of these appeals, but they will not be necessarily taking place. And in the meantime, I'm unclear, are you paid particularly with some of the disability benefits where there's a higher rate and lower rate, do you end up going back on the lower rate, or do you go on that, or do you remain on the higher rate? Does Patti, or do you know the answer to this?
So I would guess you're probably talking about ESA. Yes, if you're appealing an ESA decision, then you go to the assessment or appeal rate. It's the same amount. So it will have just gone up, but it was £73.10, so it'll be slightly more than that. Yeah, you can. I believe you can still lodge appeals, but I would probably wait until you can get advice, because submitting appeals on medical assessments is always going to be more successful if you do it with support from an advisor.
The appeal
Call us.
Call between 9 and 11, wasn't it?
Well, that's the quietest time. So yeah, do call us, please.
I know that the timeline to make appeal has also been deferred, so you've got a bit longer to make these appeals. There's a bit of a grey area that if you were refused benefits or the higher rate before this crisis happened, and your appeal date was after the crisis started, you might still have to fulfill that date. Probably will have passed now, but you should have already lodged your appeal in. There are a few cases that I know my office and Possibility people are helping with making special cases to the system. So even if your paperwork was sent out to you before this crisis started and you've missed the deadline because maybe you haven't had access to the right people, still get in contact. Not all is lost, and we will try and do our best to make a special case for you. But there is some areas where people are stuck in between. This is part of the problem, isn't it, Kate? That kind of that there are a number of people in different tranches of these different systems that get caught out, whether it's the cut-off dates, whether it's the different systems. I mean, I've got a question here, which maybe is a bit too big for us to kind of make a decision on, you and I. But the question from Ben is, what are people's views on a universal basic income? Would that help with the recovery? Does it help with some of the problems that we've got? I know that people in the Labour Party and the thinking is is not clear cut on this, but where are we edging towards at the moment? Do you know?
Yes, I think it's a really live debate again. The emergency has led to people once again looking at this idea of a flat payment to everybody that would protect people in the immediacy of the crisis, and would be very simple. You wouldn't need to show your income or your savings or apply for it in any complicated way. But I think Labour's priority at the moment, and this is certainly the position of our Shadow Chancellor, Annalisa Dodds, and of Johnny Reynolds, the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, is that the priority right now is to get money to the people who need it most, and to do that through the existing benefits that we've got, particularly for many people that will be universal credit. That's not to say there might not be a role for, and I think it's really interesting that the question alludes to how money might help in the recovery, not just to help people now in the crisis, but in the recovery too. And it's not to say that there might not be a role for some kind of helicoptering in of money to reboot the economy and get people back on their feet as we come out of the crisis. In the longer run, there are pluses and minuses to universal basic income. We'd need a much more progressive tax system than we've got currently if we wanted to make it work in this country. And we would need to think about how alongside it you would need additional costs, for example, of disability or of raising children. So it's not a panacea, but what I think is really interesting is that there are already a number of countries and cities that are experimenting with it, running pilots, trying it out. And I am quite sure that in the Labour Party, we'll want to have a look at the outcome of those experiments and the research work that's being done as we look at what the options might be for a benefit system that I believe needs to look radically different in the future from what we've inherited from the Tories, and what we've got is a system that's turned out to be mean, overly complicated, full of conditions, and where, you know, just in the discussion we've had over the last half hour, you can see how many complexities and nuances there are. And I certainly think we want to revisit that complexity.
And I mean, I guess that feeds into the point that you had made earlier, Emma, about how do we provide some payments to transition out of this, particularly for people in certain sectors that might, you know, the hospitality sector here in Brighton is perfect. It makes its profit a perfect example. Most of its profit is made during the summer months. If we open lockdown into the winter, there's going to have to be some transitionary payments to support those kind of businesses and those people who are employed in those sectors. Otherwise, here in Brighton, we're really going to struggle, because it relies on that seasonality and that seasonality of work. I
can't comment. It's above and outside our pay grade as in the advice sector.
But the advice centre is keen to see whether it's basic income or something else, that not just this support stops the day or everything is lifted, but that we think about the transition out.
It's we're set. I'd say that's something for you as politicians to think about. For us, we're very much focused on, we believe there'll be an increased demand because of the projected unemployment figures that we've been reading from the government's own think tanks and statisticians, not from our own research, but we're looking at those and thinking, what does that mean for demand? We have been working, I guess, we've had quite a complex caseload for advice providers. I think we're going to see that those people remaining on our caseload, but also a lot of people, as we've talked about, who've never ever required state support before. So I think we've got to consider how we shape our services around cohorts of people that need some help more to self-serve and are quite capable. And as I say, I think we've been very clear at the Citizens Advice in terms of what we'd like to see. We'd like to see some safe, the safety net thought about for people who are in at-risk situations. We'd like to see the removal or some sort of change to the 5-week deadline, 5-week loan period advance for universal credit, because that will just store up problems for individuals. We know it stores up problems for them. If, for example, as Patti pointed out, if you're working with a case of a household where they are in hardship because of paying back the advance, so they then get some extension of time, which means that some months where they don't have to begin paying back their advance. That situation isn't improving. That situation, we mustn't keep kicking the ball down the road for those people. So, and then thirdly, I think just to note, we are an ecosystem of support with the local authority. If their bills aren't getting paid, if their council taxes aren't paid, if their rent's not getting paid, that affects us, and they might have to look, and if the costs of COVID aren't met, then I definitely worry that would mean that charities like ours would get squeezed financially as well at a time where we're needed most.
Yeah. Look, I think we're almost at time. Is there anything, I've got another question here, which is around introducing rent caps at a future date, but I suspect that's one that we'll just have to leave hanging there. It's a very good question, but maybe for housing experts and how that affects the market to answer. And I know, just touching on that last one, I know Keir's talked about a kind of a minimum income floor or something like that, that might not be the same as a basic income where you just give money to people, but making sure that moving out of this, that we develop a society where we say this is the minimum someone needs to live and survive, and this is the expectation that we expect everyone to be able to have one way or another, whether it's through work, whether it's through pensions, whether it's through benefits and support. And maybe there's conditionality along with that, but no more can we allow people in society, maybe because they're ineligible for public funds, or maybe because they have been made intentionally homeless for one reason or another that often is not their own fault, or whether because they've fallen through the gaps. No one in our society should have to survive with less than a certain amount of resources. And hopefully, whatever that looks like going forward, that's something that we will continue to push. Look, thank you very much, Patti. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Kate, for coming along. Really appreciate it. We will try and do this again next week on another topic. And please tune in again. And remember, if you need any help or support, if you need advice, call the Citizens Advice Bureau, any of the agencies that exist in Brighton or in the Lewis district. And it's better to make sure you contact us early than later, because most of the time, the difficulties get worse the longer you leave them, not better. Okay, thank you very much for coming along, and we'll continue to try and fight for you. I hope that you'll continue to tune in the future. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.